A pilot kicked a black father off a flight for holding his crying son, snarling, "This ain't a daycare," and shoved him aggressively. What happens next will leave you speechless. They thought they could silence a father's love with violence and hate, but the truth can't be kicked off the plane. Subscribe if you stand against racism in every form. The moment Malik Dorsey stepped onto Flight 307, he felt it. That heavy, invisible pressure that clings to the air when you're being watched, judged, weighed without a word. His sneakers squeaked slightly on the slick floor of the narrow jet bridge as he boarded, Zion tucked into the gray fabric sling across his chest, his tiny fists gripping Malik's hoodie like it was the only safe place in the world. The rain from outside still tapped lightly against the fuselage, a steady rhythm that didn't soothe so much as underline the tension already crawling across Malik's skin. "Welcome aboard," a male flight attendant said politely, barely looking up from his clipboard. Malik nodded silently and stepped inside the aircraft, taking careful steps down the aisle with his carry-on bag hanging off one shoulder and a baby bag slung diagonally across his back. Zion stirred against him, letting out a soft, restless whimper. As Malik approached the front row, seat 1A, the spot he had intentionally reserved for its extra legroom and proximity to the exit, his eyes briefly met those of the lead pilot, Grady Kern, who stood near the cockpit door. Grady's expression didn't shift in welcome. Instead, his gaze narrowed, cold and clinical, as though Malik were an unexpected glitch in the system. His jaw was set, and his brow furrowed in a way that didn't need translation. Malik had seen that look before, on store clerks who assumed he couldn't afford what he was browsing, on teachers who questioned his tone before hearing his words, on supervisors who mistook his silence for defiance. It was a look that judged without context, a look that had taught him long ago to stay calm, stay composed. Still, it rattled something inside him. Malik gave a polite nod and turned toward his seat. "Almost there, little man," he whispered to Zion, who was beginning to stir more restlessly now, his soft breath hitching with the early signs of discomfort. The scent of warm formula clung to Malik's sweatshirt, and he instinctively shifted his son higher on his chest, rocking him gently. He reached his row and began to settle in, pulling out a pair of small cushioned headphones and slipping them over Zion's tiny ears. Zion squirmed, whined, and tried to swat them away. "Come on, buddy," Malik coaxed gently. "You're okay. Just a little noise, that's all." The other passengers, most of them already buckled and scrolling through phones or magazines, didn't pay much attention. A few glanced up lazily, more curious than annoyed, but none of them saw the way Grady remained near the cockpit door for an extra beat too long, his arms crossed, still watching. Malik placed a bottle of warm milk beside him and checked the pocket of the baby bag again. Extra diapers, wipes, a spare onesie, and a small plush giraffe. Everything was accounted for. He had planned for everything. It was, after all, their very first flight together since Zion's mother had passed away. Every detail mattered. As he leaned back into the seat and clicked his belt, the overhead chime announced final boarding. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the cabin crew prepared for takeoff. Just then, Zion's soft murmurs grew louder. His legs kicked against the sling as he began to cry in earnest, loud, desperate, confused sobs that echoed with sharpness through the confined cabin. Malik gently rocked him side to side, murmuring softly, "Shh. Daddy's here. It's okay, baby. We're just going up in the clouds now." He didn't notice Grady retreat into the cockpit, muttering something low to the co-pilot before sitting back in his seat. A few rows behind, a middle-aged man glanced toward Malik with mild irritation but said nothing. A younger man, perhaps in his 20s, put in earbuds and turned toward the window. From the intercom came the pilot's voice, curt and firm. "As a reminder, all passengers are expected to maintain control of their personal circumstances and minimize disruption to those around them." "Thank you," Malik paused. That wasn't the usual safety instruction. His jaw tensed. He looked up at the nearest flight attendant, a lean, clean-shaven man with soft brown eyes and a name tag that read Riley Marsh. Riley stood momentarily in the aisle, clearly caught between duty and discomfort. After a hesitant pause, he walked up to Malik and knelt slightly beside him. "Here," Riley said quietly, handing him a small packet. "Earplugs. I know it's not much, but maybe someone around you might, you know." Malik took them, nodding in appreciation, even as he noticed Riley glance nervously toward the cockpit. "Thanks," he said, his voice calm but low. Before Riley could say anything else, the cockpit door cracked open again. Grady poked his head out, locking eyes with Riley. His expression was tight, a barely veiled command radiating from his clenched jaw. Riley stood up immediately and disappeared back toward the galley. The plane's engines hummed louder as the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway. Outside, the tarmac shimmered with streaks of rain under the airport lights. Zion, still whimpering, buried his face into Malik's chest. Malik's hand instinctively tightened around his son's back. He inhaled deeply and let the air out slowly, steadying his heart. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want attention. All he wanted was to fly to Brightmoor, visit his sister, and give Zion a weekend surrounded by family, laughter, and calm. But that feeling from earlier, Grady's look, the strange announcement, Riley's silence, it was beginning to sink its hooks in deeper. Something wasn't right. Malik shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting Zion's position. He caught his own reflection in the window, exhausted eyes, unshaved jaw, and a steady expression forged from years of holding everything together. The aircraft lifted off the ground, rumbling upward into the night sky. No one noticed how the pilot, back in his seat, kept glancing at the seat map on his monitor. No one noticed how Riley hesitated before closing the service curtain near the front. And no one saw how Malik, holding his son close, quietly braced, not for turbulence from the clouds, but for something far more familiar and far more dangerous. All Malik wanted was a safe trip, but the sky had other plans. As the wheels of Flight 307 rumbled over the runway, gaining speed for takeoff, the cabin buzzed with quiet anticipation, seatbelts clicked, window shades fluttered, and engines roared, but the stillness inside was broken by a rising cry, soft at first, then sharper, more urgent. Zion's tiny voice, shrill with fear and discomfort, pierced the humming white noise. Malik Dorsey instinctively shifted in his seat, gently bouncing his 2-year-old son against his chest, whispering soothing words close to the boy's ear. "It's okay, little man. We're just getting in the air," Malik murmured, offering a soft cloth toy and then a bottle of warm milk he'd kept wrapped in a towel. Zion turned his head away, unconsoled. The lights above flickered briefly as the plane tilted upward into ascent. Malik cradled his son tighter, aware of the eyes starting to glance their way. Most passengers, though, remained disengaged, heads in books, necks tilted back with headphones on, lost in their own preoccupations. No one said a word. Then came the voice, sharp, crackling over the intercom. "This is your captain speaking. While we're still climbing, I'd like to remind all passengers to exercise basic parental responsibility. Disruptions can affect everyone's flight experience." The announcement hung in the air like a slap. Malik froze. There had been no official complaint, he was sure of it. No one had asked him to quiet his son. He glanced around and caught a few passengers exchanging puzzled looks. Others didn't react at all. Malik's chest tightened, not with guilt, but with the familiar sting of being singled out without cause. A few moments later, a tall, wiry flight attendant approached him from the aisle. His name tag read Riley. The man looked uneasy, his lips pressed in a thin line, eyes darting toward the cockpit as if worried about being watched. "Sir, I just wanted to offer these," Riley said, extending a small pack of foam earplugs. His tone was polite, almost apologetic. "Just in case it helps the passengers around you. I know you're doing your best." "Thanks," Malik replied, taking the pack without bitterness. "He's just scared. First time flying." "I understand," Riley whispered, then quickly turned back toward the front after catching a sharp glare from the cockpit. He walked stiffly like someone caught between duty and dread. Zion's cries slowed to a whimper as Malik rocked him again, humming quietly under his breath. The plane leveled out. For a few minutes, there was calm. Then footsteps, deliberate, heavy, marched down the aisle. Malik turned his head slowly, his heart sinking. Grady Kern, the lead pilot, was out of the cockpit. Wearing a neatly pressed uniform and a grim, tight jaw, Grady strode forward, eyes locked on Malik with an intensity that felt colder than the cabin air. Passengers stiffened as he passed, some straightening in their seats, others pretending not to notice. Malik remained seated, calm but alert, instinctively adjusting Zion's position in his arms. Grady stopped just inches from him. "This ain't a daycare," he snapped, loud enough for rows ahead and behind to hear. His voice was sharp, commanding, and unmistakably aggressive. "Control your kid, or get off my aircraft." Malik slowly stood, not to challenge but to defend his dignity. "I'm doing everything I can," he said evenly, eyes steady. "He's 2 years old. He's scared. That's not a crime." Grady leaned in slightly, his breath sour and hot. His voice dropped to a quieter, more poisonous tone. "People like you don't belong in premium seats anyhow." It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Quiet enough to pretend it was private, loud enough to ensure witnesses. Malik's jaw tightened. He wanted to respond, to say something that would cut back through the sting, but he didn't. Not here, not in front of Zion. Riley had stepped forward, alarm flashing across his face. "Captain Kern," he said cautiously, "maybe we should—" "Back to your post, Marsh," Grady snapped without turning his head. Riley faltered, then took a step back. Malik glanced around. Some passengers stared, eyes wide with discomfort. A few looked away, pretending to be buried in their phones or books. None intervened. Grady's posture grew more rigid, like a man itching for a reason to escalate. Malik, still standing, shifted Zion slightly and sat back down, eyes never leaving the pilot's. The toddler, sensing the tension, whimpered softly and clutched his father's shirt. Malik didn't speak again. He didn't have to, because the tension had already poisoned the air. The pilot turned, walking back toward the front with the same heavy gait, leaving behind a trail of unease. Riley hesitated for a second, gave Malik a look that said, "I'm sorry," then followed after. Malik sat silently, gently stroking Zion's hair, his heartbeat steady but fierce. He knew what had just happened. He also knew it wasn't over. Sometimes the flight path changes before the wheels even leave the ground. The moment cracked open like a thunderclap. Grady Kern stormed down the aisle with such force that several passengers startled in their seats. His boots struck the floor like hammer blows, his clenched fists trembling with fury. The plane was mid-air, cruising smoothly, but inside the cabin, the air turned electric with tension. Zion's cries echoed softly through the cabin, not shrill or piercing, just the helpless wail of a 2-year-old child who didn't understand why the world around him felt so strange. Grady didn't care. "Relocate them." "Now," he growled, eyes locked on Riley Marsh, who stood frozen in the galley, clutching a service cart with white knuckles. "Rear galley. Move them where they can't bother the rest of the flight." Riley hesitated, eyes darting between Grady and Malik. "Sir, there are no seats back there. It's against FAA code to—" Grady snapped his fingers and pointed. "That's an order." Malik, seated with Zion bundled against his chest, rose slowly and calmly. "I'm not moving. My ticket says 1A. I followed every rule. My son's just tired. He's not a threat." Grady's jaw tightened. A muscle in his cheek twitched. "This isn't a nursery. You're disrupting the cabin." "My son is too," Malik said, voice steady but firm. "You don't have the right to shove families around because a child is crying." The pilot's face turned a shade darker, his composure cracking. With a sudden burst of motion, Grady reached forward and shoved Malik hard between the shoulders. Malik stumbled, nearly collapsing over the metal armrest. Zion screamed, startled and scared, clutching his father tighter. A teenager across the aisle flinched and instinctively raised his phone. His name was Theo, a lanky, sharp-eyed boy of about 17, and his hands trembled as he hit the record button. He captured the moment. The push, the fury in Grady's eyes, and the stunned silence that rippled through the rows of passengers like a slow wave. No one spoke, no one moved. "Begin emergency descent," Grady barked, turning on his heel and signaling toward the front. "We've got a disruptive passenger. Get security ready on the ground." Riley's mouth opened slightly, stunned. "Captain, please, he hasn't done anything dangerous." "Do it," Grady snapped, "or you're off this plane next." Malik straightened slowly, his heart pounding. "There's no emergency here," he said loudly. "Check the cameras. Ask the passengers. You're the one causing the scene." But the cockpit door had already clicked shut. The hum of the engine remained steady, but the tone of the flight had shifted, charged with something ugly and unjust. Riley lingered by Malik's seat, eyes lowered. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice shaking. "I didn't want this. I swear Malik didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on Zion, whose sobs had softened into hiccups." The boy's small hand clutched the collar of his father's shirt, his wide eyes still wet with confusion and fear. 20 minutes later, the aircraft touched down with an unexpected jolt on a remote runway flanked by fog and unfamiliar lights. The voice over the intercom announced a technical delay, but no one believed it. Outside, a line of ground security officers waited in formation. As the door opened, they boarded swiftly, 5 men in black uniforms with blank expressions. They approached Malik like he was a threat, one of them reaching immediately for his arm. "You're disturbing the peace," the lead guard said. "No introduction, no questions, just cold, mechanical orders." Malik didn't resist. "You should be talking to the pilot," he said. "There are videos. People saw what happened." But the guard didn't respond. Another officer moved to reach for Zion as if to separate them. "Don't touch him," Malik shouted, stepping between them. The guard paused, hesitant. "Protocol." "He's two. He stays with me," said another officer, younger, eyes flicking briefly to the passengers behind them who had begun recording. The hesitation was brief but critical. The officer relented. Malik, still holding his son close, was led off the plane in handcuffs, his dignity stripped beneath fluorescent lights and watchful stares. Behind him, Theo sat with his phone in his lap, the video now uploaded. The screen blinked. "Posting." A silent act of rebellion. A truth no one could ignore. No one listened when Malik asked again, "Check the video." His voice echoed across the terminal walls, swallowed by silence. Zion whimpered quietly in his arms. When they stepped out into the cold air of the tarmac, the clouds overhead drifted in silence, indifferent. When fear flies higher than truth, justice waits on the runway. Malik Dorsey stumbled slightly as the officers tightened the handcuffs around his wrists. The cold steel bit into his skin, but he kept his focus on Zion, who stood nearby, confused and crying. The child reached out instinctively, but one of the airport authorities, an officer with a rigid posture and unreadable face, stepped between them, bending down to lift Zion away. Malik's eyes widened. "No, please," he said, his voice strained but steady. "Let him stay with me. He's scared." The officer didn't respond immediately. Another guard, taller and younger, hesitated a few steps behind. His hand hovered near his holster, but his eyes flicked from Malik to the trembling toddler. "He's just a baby," the younger officer finally said, his voice unsure but firm enough to break the silence. "Let the kid stay with his father. He's not a threat." For a tense moment it seemed like no one would listen. Then, without a word, the first officer reluctantly lowered Zion into Malik's arms. Zion clung to his father's shirt, still hiccuping sobs, burying his face in Malik's neck. Malik exhaled slowly, whispering, "It's okay, I've got you," though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Behind them on the tarmac, the crew from Flight 307 disembarked silently, ushered into the terminal. Grady Kern walked confidently at the front, sunglasses on, his expression unreadable. His stride was proud, as if he had just defused a bomb rather than forced a father and son off a flight. In the distance, Theo, a teenage passenger with nervous eyes, sat quietly on a bench, phone in hand. His fingers trembled as he hit upload, the video file bouncing for a moment before confirmation. No one noticed him, but the internet would. Inside the terminal, under harsh fluorescent lights, Malik was separated from the passengers and led to a plain, gray-walled holding room with a metal chair and a bolted table. A single surveillance camera in the corner stared down like an unblinking eye. He sat down slowly, cradling Zion against his chest. The toddler, still shaken, eventually quieted, exhaustion overtaking fear. His tiny breaths warmed Malik's collarbone as he fell asleep. Malik didn't move, afraid that any sudden motion would rouse him. Minutes passed, then hours. A man in a navy blazer with an heirloom badge entered. He introduced himself curtly as Lance Merton, Corporate Safety Liaison, though his tone had the stiffness of someone rehearsing a line. He sat across from Malik and immediately opened a thin folder. "We have reports stating you became physically aggressive in the cabin," Lance began, not looking up. "The captain was concerned for the safety of the crew and passengers." Malik stared at him. "Physically aggressive? He shoved me in the back. I was holding my child." Lance's lips barely moved. "That's not what we were told." "Check the video," Malik said. "Someone recorded it. You'll see everything." "We're conducting an internal review," Lance replied mechanically. "But in the meantime, due to the perceived threat to flight safety, Airlumen is issuing an indefinite travel ban. You will not be permitted on any of our future flights." Malik's heart pounded. "No charges? No explanation? Just banned?" Lance stood, closing the folder. "You're free to leave. Security will escort you out." No apology, no acknowledgement, just the quiet, polished dismissal of a man trained to avoid lawsuits and ignore humanity. Later, at the train station, Malik sat by the window of the sleeper car. Zion nestled beside him under a blanket. The rhythmic hum of the tracks couldn't drown out the humiliation still echoing in his chest. He stared out at the rain-streaked landscape, his reflection merging with Zion's sleepy form on the glass. In his lap was a thin folder, the airline's incident documentation, vague and sterile. Malik hadn't cried, not when they grabbed him, not in the back room, and not when the ban was handed down. But now, as the train pulled away from the small airport and headed back to Candler City, something in him cracked, just slightly. He didn't cry, but he blinked too long, too slow. The next morning, Malik awoke to dozens of missed calls and messages. Friends, co-workers, even strangers had messaged him. He unlocked his phone with confusion, then froze. The video. Theo's footage had gone viral overnight. It showed everything, the shove, the insults, Malik's calm response. The internet erupted. Headlines blazed across news sites. Comments flooded in, outrage, support, disbelief. Celebrities, advocates, and fellow parents weighed in. The tide had turned. He looked over at Zion, still asleep, his little chest rising and falling in peace for the first time in days. Malik touched his son's curls gently, a quiet resolve hardening in his chest. The world had finally heard him. Not because he shouted, but because someone captured the truth. The sky tried to silence him, but the ground gave him a voice. The footage hit the internet like a storm. Within hours of the video's release, news networks had splashed it across every headline. Pilot shoves Black father during flight. Airlumen under fire after alleged racial incident. And outcry grows after child witnesses father's in-flight removal. The clip, recorded from Theo's shaky phone, was only 47 seconds long, but it carried the weight of a century's worth of silence. It showed Grady shoving Malik in the back, the child's panicked screams, and Malik's steady, restrained response. And though the audio was grainy, Grady's voice came through. "This ain't a daycare." That sentence was enough. By mid-afternoon, hashtags surged through every platform: Dodger flying, while black, Shadi justice for Malik, and Iji not your babysitter. Civil rights organizations called emergency press conferences. A coalition of fathers posted solidarity videos holding their children mid-flight. Parents, influencers, and journalists rallied in support, sharing their own horror stories in airports and planes, adding more fuel to the fire. Malik sat quietly in his apartment that evening, the video playing on repeat across every major network. Zion was finally asleep, curled up beside a half-eaten sandwich and a plush airplane toy. Malik hadn't eaten. He couldn't. His hands trembled not from fear, but from fury, a deep, simmering ache that had finally found the light. All day, friends, strangers, and reporters had flooded his phone with messages. But one name stood out: Devin Rames. They met in a small office space above a downtown law firm. Devin was in his late 40s, lean and sharp, with a gaze that made people tell the truth without being asked. He'd built his reputation on cases just like this, where dignity had been denied, but the evidence refused to stay silent. "You're not going to win this in the court of public opinion," Devin said, fingers laced as he leaned across the desk. "But the good news is, you don't have to. You've got two things most of my clients never have: video and momentum. Airlumen thinks they can smother this in PR fluff. We're not giving them the chance." Malik stared out the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "I didn't ask for this," he said quietly. "I just wanted to take my son to Brightmoor. That's all." "I know," Devin said, his voice lowering. "But now you've been handed a megaphone. Either you use it, or they'll use it against you." Outside, news vans were already lining the street. The world had questions, and Malik was the reluctant answer. That evening, another video surfaced. This time it came from a different angle, not from a passenger's phone, but from a hidden source. Riley Marsh, the flight attendant who had looked torn during the incident, had quietly activated a body cam mounted on the inside of his vest. No one had known. But now, his footage told an even darker story. In the footage, Grady is heard muttering as he marches down the aisle, "People like him always want to sit up front, think they're special." "Not on my plane." The tone was chilling. The words weren't yelled, but hissed under his breath with venom and intent. The shove came next, clearer, more violent than the first video had captured, and then silence. Riley had stopped the recording once Malik was dragged away. When the footage hit the airwaves, the narrative shifted from shock to outrage. Airlumen scrambled. They issued a 2-line statement calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding and insisted they were reviewing internal procedures. They refused to name Grady. They did not mention Malik. They offered no apology. Malik's phone rang again. It was a local journalist from the Brightmoor Gazette. "Mr. Dorsey, would you care to comment on the Airline statement?" He didn't hesitate. "They kicked me off for holding my son," he said flatly. "Let's see how far they get when the whole country's watching." Devin nodded approvingly as he heard the quote played back on the evening news. "That's the first punch," he murmured. "Now let's prepare the second." Back at home, Malik sat on the floor of Zion's room, watching his son sleep beneath a blanket covered in cartoon clouds and tiny planes. He thought of his late wife, of the promises he made the night she passed, to protect, to nurture, to never back down. He hadn't chosen this fight, but it had chosen him. And now, his son's future might depend on how hard he was willing to push back. Outside, protesters began gathering near Heirloom's headquarters, men with signs, fathers with children on their shoulders, teenagers chanting Malik's name in the streets. The world was watching now, not just the courtroom, not just the cameras, but every father who'd ever held a crying child in a world that didn't care to listen. Malik opened his laptop and stared at the video once more. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply watched the moment his dignity was shoved and how calmly he held his ground. Some turbulence doesn't come from the wind. It comes from history. The first courtroom filing dropped like thunder. Devin Rames stood before the courthouse steps, sharp in a charcoal gray suit, the kind that didn't wrinkle under pressure. "We are suing Heirloom and its employee Grady Kern for physical assault, racial discrimination, and emotional distress," he announced into a sea of microphones. The press surged forward, camera shutters clicking. Behind him, Malik Dorsey kept his gaze low, his arm protectively around a squirmy Zion, who clutched a soft, well-worn teddy bear. Malik wasn't there for spectacle. He was there for truth. Inside, the legal gears turned fast. Heirloom's attorneys wasted no time responding. Their statement, cold and calculated, painted Malik as uncooperative, claiming his refusal to follow aviation protocol made him a threat to safety. They hinted that Grady had acted according to FAA guidelines in a high-pressure situation. The words twisted like wire around Malik's ribs. He remembered the shove, the sting between his shoulder blades, the look in Grady's eyes. None of it felt like protocol. A week later, in a quiet law office on the 10th floor of a downtown building, Devin received an unexpected request for a private meeting. It came from Riley Marsh. Riley sat across from him, fingers trembling as he adjusted his collar. His eyes were bloodshot. His posture slouched like he'd been carrying guilt on his back for years. "I can't stay quiet anymore," Riley said, voice barely above a whisper. "I should have said something then. But I was scared." Devin nodded slowly. "Take your time." "I've worked with Grady Kern for 5 years," Riley began, wringing his hands. "He's always been volatile, especially with certain passengers. Black passengers. I saw it. I reported it." Devin leaned forward. "Reported it to who?" "Management, human resources, supervisors, but nothing ever stuck. They always found a way to brush it off." Riley reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out a folder thick with paper. Devin opened it cautiously. The pages inside were photocopies of internal emails, shift logs, and one document labeled Crew Incident, 2022, redacted. "What is this?" Devin asked. "That's the one that broke me," Riley said, his eyes distant. "A father and his son, same situation. Grady berated the man, threatened to have him removed for not quieting his baby. It never made the news, but the father filed a complaint. The report was buried, redacted, then sealed." Devin flipped through the documents, skimming an email from a manager that read, Grady situation, let's avoid escalation, he's too valuable to lose. Another mentioned demographic risks and minimizing optics. Each line chilled him. "Why bring this to me now?" Devin asked, lowering the papers. Riley's shoulders sagged. "Because I watched that man get handcuffed for holding his baby. Because I saw the fear in that kid's eyes. Because it could have been anyone. And because I helped cover it up by staying silent." Devin's jaw clenched. The weight of the documents, the confession, the sheer scope of what had been hidden, it changed everything. This wasn't just one man's cruelty. It was a culture of silence, cultivated and protected. Riley's voice cracked. "They're going to come after me for this. I know it. But if I don't speak now, then what kind of man am I?" "You're the kind who just helped us crack the door wide open," Devon said, rising to his feet. "You're sure about going public?" Riley hesitated, then nodded. "If I don't, then nothing will change." The next morning, Malik sat at his kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling beside him. Zion napped peacefully on the couch, a soft blanket rising and falling with each breath. Devon laid the file on the table in front of him. "We've got more than a case now, Malik," he said. Malik looked up, exhaustion clouding his features. "What do you mean?" "A pattern? Emails, logs, even a redacted report about a near-identical incident. Riley gave it all to us." Malik stared at the file, hesitant to open it. He didn't want to relive the pain. But this wasn't just about him anymore. "I didn't sign up to be a symbol," Malik said softly, eyes flickering to Zion. "You didn't," Devon agreed, "but the world's listening now, and they're not going to stop." Malik ran his hand over the cover of the file, his fingers pausing on the word incident. It felt cold, detached, but the truth inside was anything but. He glanced toward his sleeping son, chest rising and falling in peace. That peace had been stolen once, but maybe, just maybe, he could make sure it was protected next time. "Let's move forward," Malik said. Devon nodded. "We'll prep for court, and this time they won't be able to hide behind policy." As night fell, Malik sat quietly at the edge of Zion's bed, watching him sleep. The house was silent except for the distant hum of city traffic. He thought about the courtroom ahead, the pressure, the scrutiny, but also about the chance to crack something open, something bigger than one bad flight. He stood and gently pulled the blanket higher over Zion's small body. A tear welled in his eye, but he didn't let it fall. The tremble in his voice had been ignored before. Not this time. When one voice trembles, it can shake an entire system. The courtroom buzzed faintly as the defense attorney stood, straightening his tie before stepping toward the jury box. His voice rang out clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is not racial discrimination or misconduct, but a case of an overwhelmed passenger who failed to control his child during a commercial flight." He paused for effect, pacing slowly. Captain Kern followed protocol. He protected the safety and comfort of the passengers. Mr. Dorsey's actions, however, volatile, loud, and uncooperative, created a disturbance that forced an emergency landing. That's the real story. Malik sat motionless beside his attorney, Devon Rames, his jaw clenched but expression calm. He had prepared for this moment, but hearing the narrative flipped so cleanly still stirred something inside him. He looked down at the photograph in his hand. Zion, smiling in the park last summer, a juice box in one hand and a toy airplane in the other. He remembered that moment clearly. No cameras, no courtrooms, just joy. He tightened his grip on the photo and raised his eyes to meet the jury. If this was a performance, he would not let truth be drowned out by fiction. Devon stood slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the jury lean forward. Then, without a word, he turned and pressed play on the courtroom's central screen. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the video flickered to life. It was Riley's body cam footage. Grainy, but clear enough. The room watched Grady Kern stride down the aisle of the plane, fury etched into his face. "This ain't a daycare," Grady barked. "Control your kid or get off my aircraft." The footage continued, capturing his shove, the jolt of Malik's body, the startled cries of Zion, and finally the last words as Grady turned away, sneering, "I'm not your babysitter." Gasps echoed around the courtroom. One juror's hand flew to his mouth. Another glanced sideways at his peers. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, her brow furrowed. Devon paused the video. The frame froze on Malik cradling Zion, wide-eyed and stunned. Devon turned slowly to face the jury. "Let the facts speak for themselves," he said, his voice even but heavy with restraint. "You've just witnessed the behavior the airline tried to excuse as standard protocol. This wasn't discipline. It was humiliation." The defense attorney stood abruptly. "Objection." "Sustained," the judge said, raising her hand, though her tone lacked conviction. But Devon wasn't finished. He turned to the bench. "Your Honor, given the footage and the context it provides, we respectfully request access to all past incident reports involving Captain Kern. This incident may not be isolated. The judge hesitated, clearly aware of the legal weight of the request. Defense? The opposing counsel shook his head. Your Honor, that's speculative and irrelevant to the current case. It's directly relevant, Devon interrupted, stepping closer. If a pattern of misconduct exists, especially involving similar passengers, it paints a very different picture of Airlumen's accountability. There was a long pause. The judge tapped her pen thoughtfully before nodding. Request granted. The court will subpoena all personnel reports, disciplinary records, and passenger complaints involving Captain Grady Kern over the last 5 years. Malik let out a quiet breath, one he didn't realize he'd been holding. The tide had shifted, but just barely. They were not celebrating yet. The next morning, court resumed with an unexpected development. During the recess, a man had contacted Devon. His name was Victor Grims, a former Airlumen flight attendant. He sat now on the witness stand, nervous but resolved, gripping the edges of the seat. I flew with Grady Kern, Victor began, his voice a little shaky. A few years ago, we had a situation. A black father with 2 sons in economy. The boys were laughing, maybe a little loud, but they were just kids. Grady ordered them separated and accused the father of intimidating staff. There was no incident report filed. I thought that was odd. Devon stepped forward. Did you ever follow up? I tried, Victor said, nodding. I asked HR. A few weeks later, I was called in and told to stop digging. Months later, I was let go with a severance package and a confidentiality agreement. At the time, I signed it. But after seeing Mr. Dorsey's story, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Did Grady ever face consequences? Not that I know of, Victor answered. If he did, the records are buried. The courtroom murmured again. This wasn't just about Malik anymore. It was bigger. A system that shielded misconduct, protected the abuser, and punished silence. Devon glanced at the judge. Her expression had hardened. She knew this was no longer a civil suit about a crying child. Airlumen's attorneys scrambled. Their team requested a recess to review the implications of new testimony. But damage had already been done. The judge ordered the airline to produce full HR records, unedited, without delay. As the courtroom slowly emptied for the day, Malik remained seated, staring at the photograph in his hand again. Zion's smile now felt like a beacon, a reminder of what he was fighting for. Not revenge, not fame, but a future where his son could cry in public and still be treated with dignity. Devon leaned in. That was a turning point, he whispered. Malik nodded. Let's make sure it doesn't turn back. He stood, quietly slipping the photograph into his coat pocket. Outside the courthouse, press buzzed. Inside, a judge prepared for a case that had just outgrown its frame. Truth sometimes needs more than one door to break through, but once it enters, it never leaves quietly. The courtroom lights cast a sterile glow across the polished floor as the judge called for a brief recess to prepare for the next witness. The quiet hum of whispered speculation filled the gallery. Everyone knew something was coming, something big. Devon Rames, seated beside Malik at the plaintiff's table, leaned in and spoke under his breath, his voice low and deliberate. They're about to open the vault. Malik nodded slowly, his jaw tight. He hadn't slept much the night before. Zion had fallen asleep curled against his chest, clutching the same toy plane he'd carried since the ordeal began. Every click of a reporter's camera, every shifting movement in the gallery sounded louder than it should. But Malik's mind was still, focused, ready. The judge re-entered, rapped the gavel once, and the room settled. Proceed, the judge said. Devon stood. Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to introduce newly discovered internal communications between the defendant, Grady Kern, and senior Airlumen staff. A beat of silence. Then the screen behind the witness box flickered to life. The first email appeared. It was dated 2 months before Malik's flight. From Grady Kern to a regional operations manager. Let's not let the noise in coach ruin premium again. That incident last spring should have been a lesson. Tighten the gate screeners. Flag early. No more daycares in the sky. A sharp intake of breath echoed from the gallery. Devon advanced the slides slowly. Another email surfaced, this time from a supervisor to multiple crew leads. Update the high-risk passenger list. Focus on demographic risk factors. Avoid repeat disruptions. The words hung in the air like a toxic fog. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the projector. Malik's eyes narrowed. His name was listed in one of the emails, pre-flagged before his flight. Malik Dorsey. Traveling with minor. Monitor closely. Mark priority for seat relocation if needed. Mr. Dorsey had never flown before, Devon said quietly, stepping forward. This was his first time, and they flagged him because of what? His name? His seat choice? Or something else they didn't want to say aloud? In the witness box, Riley Marsh sat with trembling hands. Devon nodded toward him. Mr. Marsh, please confirm. You received these directives? Riley swallowed, his voice shaking. Yes. We were told to identify possible escalations early. Certain demographics were listed more often. What did they mean by that? Devon asked, softly but firmly. Riley looked at Malik. His eyes were wet. They meant black passengers, sir, especially single fathers, ones traveling with babies. Gasps echoed again. Riley lowered his head. I was warned not to speak up. I was told it would complicate my career if I made it about race. Malik felt his stomach twist, not in surprise, but in confirmation. The unease he felt the moment he stepped on that plane, it had a name now. It had evidence. The defense scrambled to object, citing context and confidentiality, but the judge overruled. The court finds these materials relevant. Proceed. Devon took a moment, then called the next witness. Grady Kern. He entered the courtroom with shoulders stiff and chin high, as if he were still in uniform. He took the stand with the same arrogance he wore mid-flight. Sworn in, he sat straight, arms folded neatly. Captain Kern, Devon began, do you recognize these emails? Yes, Grady replied flatly. And do you deny their content? Number. But they've been taken out of context. Devon approached slowly. Context? Help us understand. What context makes it acceptable to label a passenger high risk based on their child's age or their background? Grady didn't blink. You don't understand the pressure of maintaining cabin control. Passengers need discipline. If someone can't control their child, they shouldn't be in premium. The jury collectively stiffened. One older man shook his head slowly. Another juror, a young father himself, clenched his jaw. So, it's discipline in the sky? Devon repeated. That's right, Grady said. I run my flights like I run my cockpit. Structured, clean, no disruptions. Malik stared at him, absorbing every word. The man who shoved him, humiliated him, had no remorse. None. Just policy and pride. Devon turned to the judge. No further questions. The silence that followed was deafening. The courtroom wasn't just quiet, it was cold. Every person present felt the shift. The case had turned. What began as a question of behavior had cracked open a system. Outside the courtroom doors, the hum of press microphones buzzed like a swarm. Inside, Zion's laughter broke through the stillness. He was in the hallway just beyond the double doors, giggling as he played with his toy airplane. Malik turned toward the sound, a soft smile breaking the tension in his face. He would never let this boy know what nearly broke him. He walked over during the recess and knelt beside his son. Zion lifted the toy. This one doesn't crash, Daddy, he said with a grin. Malik's eyes glistened and he nodded, his voice steady. This one doesn't crash. In the search for justice, sometimes even the black box of silence gets cracked open. Protests flared like wildfires outside the towering glass headquarters of Airline, their logo flickering behind rows of riot barriers and flashing cameras. Chants echoed through the streets of Brightmoor. Justice for Malik, justice for Zion. Placards waved above the crowd, some bearing stills from the video of the shove, others quoting Grady's damning words. Drivers honked in support as they passed, and reporters jockeyed for position, narrating live from the chaos. Inside the building, executives huddled behind closed doors, blinds drawn, their voices low but urgent. The pressure wasn't just public, it was beginning to rupture the company from within. That same morning, an anonymous whistleblower leaked a file titled Cabin Conduct, Managing In-Flight Conflict, a training manual once reserved for internal use only. The language inside was chilling. Phrases like avoid escalation with assertive passengers from sensitive demographics and be mindful of optics when interacting with passengers of concern weren't just tone-deaf, they were coded and discriminatory. Screenshots flooded social media within hours. Activists, journalists, and civil rights attorneys pounced. Malik, watching the coverage from his modest apartment, sat frozen on the edge of his couch, Zion asleep beside him on a pillow of folded blankets. Devin Rames, pacing their small living room, scanned the manual again. "This isn't just negligence," he said, jaw clenched. "This is a culture. This is policy." Malik leaned forward, fingers laced together, elbows resting on his knees. "They knew what they were doing," he murmured, "and they trained others to do it too." Airlumen's damage control machine spun into overdrive. That afternoon, their legal team quietly delivered a sealed envelope to Devin's office, an offer for a 7-figure settlement. It came with non-disclosure clauses, a gag order, and the promise of no admission of guilt. Malik read the letter in silence. His hands trembled slightly as he held the pages, but his voice was steady when he finally spoke. "I didn't fight this far to make it disappear." Devin said nothing at first. He simply nodded, folded the letter, and placed it back into the envelope. Hours later, Malik stood before a podium at an impromptu press conference. The building behind him wasn't grand. It was the community center where he'd once taken Zion for story time. Still, the room was filled with local news crews, live streams, and dozens of supporters pressed shoulder to shoulder. "I was offered money today," Malik began, his voice echoing softly. "A lot of it. They wanted to buy silence, but I didn't come here to sell dignity. I came here to protect it." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Camera flashes blinked like distant lightning. Back at Airlumen, the unrest deepened. Riley Marsh, no longer hiding behind quiet compliance, posted a resignation letter on his personal blog. It wasn't subtle. He named Grady Kern, described the culture of fear and complicity among the crew, and announced that he would testify before a federal oversight committee investigating Airlumen's conduct. The letter was shared over 100,000 times in 2 days. Within the company's leadership, panic mounted. Executives were no longer simply shielding themselves from bad PR, they were trying to outrun legal consequences. Late one evening, a breaking news banner crept across television screens nationwide. 2 top Airlumen executives resign amid investigation. One was the vice president of operations, the other the chief of training. Neither issued public statements. Behind the scenes, sources confirmed they were forced out to mitigate regulatory fallout. Malik's story didn't just remain a headline, it ignited something deeper. Parents across the country began posting their own experiences, stories of being harassed for holding crying babies, escorted off planes for asking too many questions, or profiled during boarding. Hashtags like #SheTeachesParent, Flight Rights, and #Ouchie Flying While Black trended on every major platform. Some called it a movement, others called it long overdue. Malik watched it all unfold with a quiet intensity. The attention hadn't changed him, but it had sharpened his resolve. "Holding your child is not a crime," he told a news anchor during a follow-up interview. His tone was calm, but there was fire behind his eyes. "I'm not doing this just for me and Zion. I'm doing it because too many parents have been flying scared. That ends now." Later that night, as he tucked Zion into bed, the boy stirred and mumbled something sleepily. Malik brushed his hair back and kissed his forehead, the city lights flickering outside the window. In the stillness of that moment, the weight of the journey pressed on his shoulders, but so did a new sense of momentum. The fight was no longer just inside courtrooms. It was in headlines, classrooms, boardrooms, and most powerfully in everyday voices refusing to be ignored. As Malik stood by the window, watching the distant lights of a plane blink against the night sky, he whispered under his breath, "Sometimes it takes one father's pain to carry the weight of many." The courtroom was silent as the foreman of the jury rose, a folded slip of paper gripped between his fingers. The judge gave a subtle nod, and the foreman cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Malik Dorsey, on all counts." The words struck like thunder. For a moment there was no reaction, just the stunned stillness of people absorbing a verdict that felt bigger than any one case. Then a ripple of gasps, whispers, and a slow-building applause filled the room. Malik didn't move right away. He sat still at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded tightly on the polished wood, as if afraid to believe it. Devin Rames, seated beside him, gave his shoulder a firm squeeze. "You did it," Devin whispered, his voice low but certain. "We did it." Malik's eyes welled up, but he didn't let the tears fall. Instead, he looked across the room to the bench where his son, Zion, sat perched between two court aides, clapping enthusiastically in his tiny shirt that read, "My daddy stood up while flying down." The sight knocked the wind out of Malik more than any testimony ever could. Judge Morrison raised his gavel to bring order back. In addition to damages awarded to Mr. Dorsey, this court mandates a federal audit of Air Lumen's employee training procedures, disciplinary practices, and in-flight passenger protocols, he said firmly. His gaze swept the room. Furthermore, this court grants the plaintiff's request to enforce a new national provision, requiring all U.S. commercial carriers to publicly disclose in-flight removals, passenger complaints, and verified bias incidents. These measures will begin immediately and be reviewed annually by an independent aviation oversight board. The defense table remained stone-faced. Grady Kern, the man whose arrogance had once filled the aircraft cabin like fuel vapors, now looked like he'd been grounded for good. His flight license would be revoked, the court had ruled, pending further investigation and disciplinary review by the FAA. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at Malik. He just sat, shoulders tight, staring down at the empty surface of the table in front of him. Reporters scribbled madly from their seats, typing headlines that would echo nationwide before the hour was up. Outside, camera crews were already circling like satellites. The gravity of the decision had pulled in everyone, news outlets, policy advocates, even other passengers who had followed the trial every day like it was the only thing that mattered. For many of them, it was. As the buzz died down, Judge Morrison turned to Malik. "Mr. Dorsey, if you wish to address the court, you may do so." Malik stood slowly. His heart pounded in his chest, not from nerves, but from weight. The weight of what had happened. The weight of what had changed. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, took a breath, and walked to the center of the courtroom floor. He didn't look at Grady. He didn't need to. His eyes settled on the bench where his son sat, beaming. "I didn't come here for revenge," Malik began, his voice steady. "I came here for something much harder to ask for. I came for understanding. I came for dignity." He paused, searching for words that could carry the truth without being buried in emotion. "I wanted my son to grow up in a world where fathers don't get punished for loving out loud," he continued, "for holding their child, for calming a scared baby on a plane, for being human. I wanted my son to know that when something wrong happens to you, you don't have to hide. You can speak. You can stand." He looked around the courtroom, letting the silence stretch just long enough to leave a mark. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about every father, every mother, every passenger who's ever been treated like a problem just because of who they are or how they look. We've all seen it. Some of us have lived it. But today, we did something about it. From the gallery, Zion raised his hand and waved, his little face bright with joy. Malik chuckled softly. "That's my boy," he said, smiling through misty eyes. Judge Morrison nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Mr. Dorsey." As Malik returned to his seat, Devon leaned in, voice low. "We're not done yet. This ruling opens doors. Big ones." Malik nodded slowly, his jaw tightening with quiet resolve. "Then let's walk through them," he said. The judge banged the gavel once more. "Court is adjourned." As people began to rise, the courtroom erupted into applause. Reporters rushed toward the exits, already dialing their stations. Lawyers exchanged looks, some proud, some calculating. Devon gathered the case files while Zion ran toward his father with open arms. Malik scooped him up easily, resting the boy on his hip. He looked around the courtroom, this place that had become a battleground, a sanctuary, and a spotlight all in one. A place where he had entered quietly with a baby in his arms and now stood as a symbol of something greater. Outside the courthouse, crowds were waiting. Some held signs, others held cameras. But Malik held his son. He took a breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped out into the sunlight. When they tried to ground him, they forgot. His story had wings. 3 months had passed since the verdict, but the echoes of the courtroom still followed Malik wherever he went. He sat alone at his kitchen table one morning, flipping through letters, some handwritten, some typed, all filled with gratitude. Parents, activists, even airline employees had reached out, calling him brave, thanking him for speaking up when it would have been easier to disappear. But Malik wasn't interested in praise. He wanted action. He wanted change that would last beyond headlines. That's when he first sketched the idea for Flight Forward on a napkin. It wasn't much, just a name, a mission statement, and 3 bullet points. Educate, empower, enforce. He imagined a program that would train flight crews on racial sensitivity, conflict de-escalation, and parental dignity. But it had to be more than just another diversity seminar. It had to reach hearts, not just check boxes. With the help of Devin and a few volunteer educators, Malik began pitching the idea to unions and travel consortiums. At first, there was silence, then a trickle of interest, then a letter that stopped him in his tracks. It came from a senior pilot at Corvax Air, a man named Bryant Hayes. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. "Mr. Dorsey, I watched your testimony. I saw the pain, and I saw the strength. If your program ever needs a platform within the industry, real pilots, real crew, real problems, I'd be proud to help. Sincerely, Captain Bryant Hayes." Corvax Air Malik read the letter 3 times before setting it down beside Zion's toy airplane. He stared out the window as a distant plane soared through the clouds, a shadow drifting across the glass. Maybe it was time to stop fearing the sky. Still, he didn't board a plane, not yet. Instead, he traveled by train, visiting universities, conference halls, and union panels. He stood in front of rooms full of people in uniforms, showing them the videos, walking them through what had happened, not just to him, but to dignity itself. In one session, a young trainee raised his hand and asked, "What do you tell a crew member who's scared of confrontation?" Malik didn't hesitate. "You train him until he's more afraid of silence than doing the right thing." The room fell quiet. Word of Flight Forward spread quickly. Its curriculum was direct but compassionate. It asked airline staff to do what Grady Kern never did: listen. But the biggest surprise came in the form of a private email from Airlumen itself. The sender was unfamiliar: Wesley Brann, interim CEO. Malik read it slowly, noting the carefully chosen words. Wesley acknowledged the company's loss of public trust and requested a private meeting, suggesting that Airlumen was ready to move forward if guided responsibly. Malik stared at the screen, conflicted. It felt like being asked to shake hands with the storm that once tried to sink you. Devin called shortly after. "You're thinking about going, aren't you?" "I don't know," Malik admitted. "What if it's just PR?" "Then make sure it's not," Devin replied firmly. "But if they're offering a seat at the table, you sit. You sit, and you bring your own chair if you have to." The meeting was set for a Tuesday at Airlumen's headquarters in Brightmoor. Malik arrived early, walking through security with a simple folder in hand and Zion's old pacifier keychain clipped to his briefcase. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was now standing in the very building that once tried to erase him. Wesley Brann greeted him with a forced smile and an extended hand. "Mr. Dorsey, thank you for coming." Malik didn't return the smile. He just nodded and said, "Let's get to it." Inside the boardroom, executives sat in silence. Charts and mock-ups lined the walls, ideas for rebuilding trust and engaging new demographics. It all felt like theater. Malik waited until the chatter died down. Then he stood. "You want help fixing your image," he began, "but I'm not here for branding. I'm here for truth." The room went still. "I'll work with you, under one condition," he continued. "You acknowledge your wrongs, publicly, not buried in footnotes, not buried in spin, in front of the same cameras that watched me be dragged off your plane." The air thickened with discomfort. Wesley exchanged glances with a PR advisor, then nodded slowly. "We can prepare a joint statement." "No," Malik cut in. "Not a statement, a press event. You stand next to me. You say the words yourself." There was a long pause. Then, surprisingly, Wesley agreed. The press event was scheduled for the following week. The venue, a modest hall inside the city's civic center. Reporters packed in early, their equipment blinking like city lights. A banner behind the podium read, "Restoring Trust Takes Flight." Malik arrived in a plain navy suit, his palms sweating slightly. In the front row, Zion sat cross-legged on the carpet, building a little tower from plastic blocks. The cameras zoomed in on him often, unaware that his quiet game was the very reason the world was watching. Wesley stepped up first. His voice trembled as he spoke. "We failed. Not just in policy, but in people. We failed a father and his child, and we are here not to erase that failure, but to learn from it." Then he stepped aside. Malik took the podium. He looked out at the flashing lights, the clicking shutters, and then down at his son. The weight in his chest wasn't anger anymore. It was purpose. "I didn't come here to accept an apology," he said. "I came to demand change and to help build it." There was silence, followed by thunderous applause. Some in the crowd stood. A few wiped away tears. As Malik stepped down, Zion looked up, unaware of the storm that had been weathered. The mountain moved. His father smiled, crouching to pick up one of the fallen building blocks beside him. "Come on, champ," he whispered. "Let's go build something better." And as the press cameras flickered and the room slowly emptied, Malik stood firm, no longer the man who'd been shoved on a plane, but the one who stood for every father who'd been told to sit down. Sometimes the smallest passenger shifts the entire flight path. Malik sat quietly in the wooden bench near the back of courtroom 6C, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the young man seated at the plaintiff's table. Caleb Mann, early 30s, nervous but proud, clutched a folded sheet of paper, his opening remarks trembling slightly in his hand. The courtroom buzzed faintly with murmurs from press members, activists, and curious observers. But the moment the judge entered, the chatter ceased. The clerk called the case and Malik straightened in his seat. He wasn't here to fight today, he was here to stand for someone else. Caleb's story was disturbingly familiar. Removed from a Transnova Airways flight weeks earlier for attempting to bottle-feed his 6-month-old son mid-flight, he had been labeled suspicious, uncooperative, and creating a disruption in the crew's report. Surveillance footage later showed nothing more than a father holding a baby, cradling him close as he gently pressed a bottle to the infant's lips. But the airline had already issued its decision. Caleb was banned indefinitely. It might have ended there, a forgotten moment in an overwhelmed news cycle, if Caleb hadn't seen Malik on the news. That was when he decided he wouldn't be silenced. Now, Malik was called as a character witness, not just for Caleb, but for every parent who had been forced into shame and silence aboard planes meant to serve all passengers equally. When his name was announced, a ripple ran through the room. Even the judge seemed to pause with recognition. Malik stood slowly, his navy blue blazer neat but modest, and approached the witness stand with calm purpose. The opposing counsel watched him warily, but the jury leaned forward. "Mr. Dorsey," the attorney began, "can you tell us why you've chosen to testify today?" Malik's voice was even but firm. "Because I've been in that seat. I've been the father they tried to label a threat, and I know what it feels like when your love for your child is treated like a liability." He scanned the room, briefly locking eyes with Caleb, who nodded subtly. "I'm not here to sensationalize," Malik continued. "I'm here because this isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern. One where quiet bias hides behind safety language. One where fathers like us are expected to sit still while we're quietly pushed out of sight." The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Malik then shared the heart of his story, not the headlines, but the nights of doubt, the therapy sessions with his son, the trembling hands at train stations where flights once would have been faster. He spoke of the damage done, not just to reputation but to the sacred trust between a parent and the world around them. Caleb listened with tears in his eyes. As Malik stepped down, applause was quickly hushed by the gavel, but the message had landed. During the court recess, reporters gathered outside, but Malik declined interviews. Instead, he walked alongside Caleb to a quiet bench near the courthouse fountain. They didn't speak much at first, just sat in a mutual understanding, the sound of water trickling beside them. "Thank you," Caleb finally said, voice hoarse. "You could have stayed out of this." Malik shook his head. "And missed the chance to make sure the next father doesn't go through what we did?" Later that week, headlines reported something remarkable. The FAA had quietly passed a new enforcement policy, mandatory body cams for all in-flight crew members, inspired by Riley Marsh's decision to hit record when no one else would. The footage from Malik's flight had become more than evidence. It had become precedent. In the days that followed, Malik was invited to Capitol Hill, not as a protester, but as a collaborator. He met with lawmakers behind closed doors, working to shape the passenger dignity bill. The discussions were intense. Airline lobbyists resisted fiercely, but the tide was turning. Malik stood before the committee, presenting a binder filled with testimonies from fathers across the country, each one a quiet storm waiting to be heard. "We're not just buying seats," he told Congress, his voice firm but composed. "We're carrying futures." On his way out of the hearing room, a young man approached. Early 20s, slouched with hesitation but eyes filled with recognition. He stopped Malik gently in the hallway. "I used to be afraid to hold my son on planes," he said, "until I saw you." Malik's heart caught for a moment, not in pride, but in gravity. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder, nodded once, and continued walking. Change doesn't always roar. It whispers through courage. Zion pressed his tiny hands to the window, his breath leaving soft clouds on the glass as he watched another plane glide across the sky. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting a warm, orange glow across their modest Candler City apartment. Malik stood behind him, arms folded, a mug of untouched coffee cooling in his hand. He'd seen that look in his son's eyes before, a mixture of wonder and curiosity, but today it came with a question he wasn't ready for. "When will I get to fly again, Daddy?" The words landed heavier than expected. Malik's fingers tightened around the mug, the porcelain creaking faintly. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant roar of jet engines and the soft hum of their kitchen light. Zion turned around, tilting his head. "I liked the last flight. Remember the one with the snacks and the sticker they gave me?" Malik forced a smile, though his chest tightened. "I remember, buddy," he said gently, crouching down to ruffle Zion's curls. But the truth was, since the trial, he hadn't stepped foot on a plane. He had spoken in packed auditoriums, met with lawmakers, even helped reshape federal flight policy, but he had not flown. Not once. The sky still carried too much memory. The aisle, the shove, the look of confusion on Zion's face, that cockpit door slamming shut. Even now, the memory could leave him breathless. But Zion was growing, and so was his world. Malik knew that healing couldn't remain grounded forever. Maybe the real victory wasn't winning the case, it was proving that the sky no longer had the power to terrify them. That night, after Zion had fallen asleep clutching his toy airplane, Malik opened his laptop. He searched for short regional flights, routes he used to avoid. Eventually, he landed on a direct 1-hour trip to Bellevue City, just long enough to feel the takeoff and landing, short enough to pull back if he needed. His finger hovered over the Confirm Booking button for almost a full minute before pressing it. The day of the flight arrived faster than expected. Zion bounced in excitement, wearing a bright yellow sweater with cartoon wings stitched on the front. Malik packed light, just a change of clothes, snacks, and a folder of travel documents. But the emotional weight he carried couldn't be stuffed into a bag. At the airport terminal, familiar sights flooded Malik's senses: the overhead announcements, the soft rumble of luggage wheels, the whoosh of automatic glass doors. He inhaled slowly, forcing calm into his body. Zion gripped his hand tightly, not from fear, but excitement. As they approached the gate, several passengers recognized him. Whispers spread like ripples. A few men nodded respectfully. One offered a quiet, "Thank you for what you did." Malik responded with a simple nod, not out of pride, but caution. He wasn't here as an icon. He was here as a father. When their boarding group was called, Malik's heart pounded harder than he expected. As they stepped into the aircraft, a male flight attendant greeted them with a steady smile. The man was young, probably in his late 20s, and his voice carried warmth without overcompensating. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Dorsey," he said, offering a firm handshake. "It's an honor." Malik nodded, his grip strong, but his eyes scanned the crew's demeanor, instinctively assessing the tone of the cabin. That's when he noticed the badge on the attendant's vest, neatly stitched in bold navy thread, proudly trained by Flight Forward. For a moment, Malik froze. He didn't expect to see it. Not yet. The initiative he built, born from pain, was now stitched into the fabric of the very system that once failed him. The attendant leaned slightly closer and added, "My name's Ellis. I went through your program last month. Changed the way I look at this job, sir." Malik's throat tightened, but he gave a small, grateful smile. "Glad to hear that, Ellis. Really." Zion tugged at his sleeve, eager to reach their seats. As they settled in, row 2A and 2B, Zion immediately pressed his face against the window, giggling at the sight of the wing and the flashing lights on the tarmac. Malik looked around. No hostility, no tension, just regular passengers buckling in, reading safety cards, adjusting air vents. For the first time in a long time, the plane didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like transportation. It felt like progress. The engines rumbled to life and the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Zion squirmed in his seat, eyes wide as the aircraft rolled into position. Malik inhaled slowly, the sound of the engines vibrating through his ribs. Then came the moment, the lift, the rise from the ground. Malik instinctively reached for his son's hand. Zion grinned and wrapped his small fingers around Malik's. "We're flying!" he exclaimed. Malik looked out the window. The city below grew smaller, the clouds rolled past like slow-moving hills, and for the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt at this altitude in years. Peace. No panic. No shame. Just a father and son, lifted by justice and time. The same sky that tried to break them now carried them higher than ever before. 1 year later, beneath a cobalt-blue sky streaked with thin cirrus clouds, Malik Dorsey stood still as stone before the crowd gathered at Candler City Airport. The breeze carried a faint scent of jet fuel and dew-drenched concrete as dozens of spectators looked toward the newly unveiled mural behind him, a sweeping piece of art spanning nearly 50 feet. It depicted a father holding a child at the edge of a runway, their silhouettes framed by the rising sun, and trails of smoke from distant aircraft curving behind them like angelic wings. The child in the mural clutched a toy airplane. The father's head was tilted upward, not in fear, but in quiet triumph. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd as photographers raised their lenses and civic leaders murmured admiration. But Malik barely noticed them. His eyes lingered on the mural's detail, the way the child's tiny hand gripped the man's coat, the slight tilt in the man's shoulders drawn to convey weight and grace all at once. It was uncanny how much it mirrored his own memories forged not in paint, but in bruises, courtroom benches, and long nights cradling Zion in silence. He stepped forward to the small podium set just beneath the artwork. The microphone whined briefly before settling. Malik leaned in, cleared his throat, and let the weight of the moment rest on his shoulders. "I won't keep you long," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "This mural, it's not about one man or one flight. It's about everyone who decided not to be silent. It's for those who chose truth over comfort and courage over convenience." His eyes swept across the faces in the crowd. Some nodded solemnly. A few dabbed their eyes. At the far end, he spotted Devin Rames, his former attorney, now wearing a charcoal suit with no tie, his arms crossed and a look of quiet pride on his face. Standing beside a news crew, Devin raised a hand in acknowledgement and gave Malik a slow, respectful nod. Just behind the front row, Riley Marsh stood partially in shadow, his name tag glinting faintly. Human Rights Liaison, International Flight Coalition. He looked older, more serious, the creases in his forehead deeper than before, but his posture was upright, grounded. Their eyes met briefly, and Riley gave a small, apologetic smile, the kind of smile that didn't erase the past but honored its lessons. Malik returned the expression with a subtle dip of his chin. Then came a tug at his fingers. Zion. The boy had grown in the past year, taller, with a mop of tight curls and eyes that always seemed to search the sky. In his free hand was the same toy airplane he'd held during the trial months ago, its nose slightly chipped from too many crash landings across their apartment floor. Zion looked up at the towering mural and blinked. "That's us on the wall, right?" he asked, his voice small but filled with certainty. Malik knelt slowly, the old pain in his knees flaring just briefly. He rested a hand on Zion's shoulder and looked him in the eye. "That's every father," he said gently, "who refused to sit down when the world told him to." The boy beamed, hugging his father around the neck, and Malik closed his eyes, holding his son tight. The crowd erupted in applause, but Malik didn't stand immediately. He let the sound wash over him, not as praise but as closure. Every flash of a camera was a reminder of how far they'd come. Every handshake, every smile, every nod was a stitch in the fabric of a new narrative, one no longer written by silence or shame. As he finally rose, Malik looked to the mural again. The wings of smoke behind the father and child now seemed to shimmer in the light. A plane soared overhead, its roar momentarily overtaking the applause, and Zion pointed toward it with delight. "Maybe we can go up there again sometime?" Zion asked, eyes wide with hope. Malik looked up, not with panic, not with hesitation, but with resolve. "One day soon," he replied. "We'll fly again." As the crowd began to disperse, journalists shuffled their notes, and airport staff ushered guests toward the exit lounge. Malik stayed rooted. He wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. The moment was too sacred. This place, once just concrete and terminals, was now a monument to something far greater. He turned once more toward the mural, the wind nudging his jacket gently, and whispered under his breath as if to the clouds above. once silenced. At 30,000 feet, his voice now echoes from the ground to the clouds. He faced hate, but didn't back down. If you believe in standing strong for family and dignity, subscribe now. Your voice fuels the fight for justice. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights the harsh realities of racial discrimination, abuse of power, and the dehumanization Black parents face. This narrative seeks to raise awareness, spark critical conversation, and inspire action against injustice and racism in all forms.